Chapter 13. Evangeline felt Will's light touch on her shoulder. She gave a small start of surprise. Even though she had been lying awake, she hadn't heard him approaching. "It's all right," she said quietly. "I'm awake." "The moon's down," Will replied equally softly. "It's time to go." She tossed back the blankets and sat up. She was fully dressed apart from her boots. She reached for them and began to pull them on. Will handed her a bundle of rags he had cut from his blanket. "Tie these around your feet," he told her. "They'll muffle the sound on the shingle." She saw that he had swathed his own feet in large bundles of cloth, and she hurried to do the same. Through the thin wall between the lean-to and the dormitory, they could hear the sound of men snoring and muttering in their sleep. One of the Scandians broke out in a fit of coughing, and Will and Evangeline froze, waiting to see if he had woken anyone. After a few minutes, the dormitory settled down again. Evangeline finished tying the cloth bundles around her feet and stood, following Will to the door. He had greased the hinges on the lean-to door with fat from the cooking pot. Holding his breath, he eased the door open, letting go a sigh of relief when it swung silently. With no moon, the beach was a dark expanse and the water a black sheet, dimly reflecting the starlight. The weather had been moderating over the past few days. The night was clear and the wind had dropped considerably, but they could still hear the dull thunder of waves crashing against the outer face of the island. Evangeline could just make out the dark bulk of the two wolf ships drawn up on the beach. To one side there was a smaller shape, the skiff, left there by Svengel after his latest fishing trip. That was where they were heading. Patiently, Will pointed out the route he had selected. They had gone over it all earlier in the night, but he wanted to make sure she remembered. Unseen movement was almost second nature to him, but he knew that Evangeline would be nervous once she was in the open. She would want to reach the ships quickly. And speed meant noise and a greater chance of being heard or seen. He put his mouth very close to her ear and spoke in the lightest of whispers. "Take it easy. The benches first, then the rocks, then the ships. Wait for me there." She nodded. He could see her swallowing nervously, and he sensed that her breathing was speeding up. He squeezed her shoulder gently. "Calm down, and remember, if anyone does come out, freeze wherever you are." That was the key to it all in uncertain light like this. A watcher might miss seeing a person standing perfectly still, but the slightest movement would draw the eye instantly. Again she nodded. He patted her shoulder gently. "Off you go," he said. She took another deep breath, then stepped out into the open. She felt horribly exposed as she moved toward the shelter of the benches and the table, 10 meters away from the huts. The dim starlight now seemed as bright as day, and she forced herself to move slowly, placing her feet deliberately, fighting the temptation to rush for cover. The cloth padding on her feet did a good job muffling the sound of her footsteps, but even so the crunching of the shingle seemed deafening to her. 4 more paces. 3, 2, 1. Heart pounding, pulse racing, she sank gratefully into the shadow of the rough table and benches. There was a small cluster of rocks halfway down the beach. That was her next goal. She hesitated, wanting to stay in the comforting shadow provided by the table. But she knew if she didn't go soon, she might never have the courage to move. She stepped out resolutely, one foot after the other, wincing at the muted scrunching of the stones underfoot. This part of the journey took her directly in front of the door to the dormitory. If any of the Scandians came out, she must be seen. She reached the shelter of the rocks and felt the welcoming protection of the shadows wrap around her once again. The hardest part of the trip was now over. She took a few seconds to let her pulse settle, then moved off toward the ships. Now that she was nearly there, she wanted desperately to run, but she fought the temptation and moved slowly and smoothly into the darkness beside Wolffang. Utterly exhausted, she sank to the damp stones, leaning against the ship's planking. Now she watched as Will followed her footsteps. There were scattered clouds scudding across the sky, sending a series of darker shadows rippling over the beach. Will matched his movement to the rhythm of the wind and clouds and moved, sure-footed, along the track Evangeline had just followed. She caught her breath in surprise as he seemed to disappear after the first few meters, melding into the pattern of moving light and shade and becoming part of the overall picture. She saw him again briefly at the benches and then at the rocks. Then he seemed to rise out of the ground a few meters from her. She shook her head in amazement. No wonder people thought rangers were magicians, she reflected. Unaware of her reaction, Will grinned quickly at her and moved closer so they could talk. "All right?" he asked in a lowered tone, and when she nodded, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" This time there was no hesitation. "I'm sure," she said firmly. He gripped her shoulder again in a gesture of encouragement. "Good for you." Will glanced around. They were far enough from the huts now, and there was little chance of their voices being overheard, and the wind, although not as boisterous as it had been, provided plenty of cover as well. He felt Evanlyn could use some encouragement, so he pointed to the skiff. "Remember, this thing is small. It's not like the wolf ships. It'll ride over the big waves, not crash through them, so we're as safe as houses." He wasn't sure about the last two statements, but they seemed logical to him. He'd watched the gulls and penguins around the island riding the massive waves, and it seemed that the smaller you were, the safer you were. He was carrying a large wineskin, stolen from the provisions cabinet. He'd emptied the wine out and refilled the skin with water. It didn't taste too good, but it would keep them alive. Besides, he thought philosophically, the worse it tasted, the longer it would last them. He placed it carefully in the bottom of the skiff, and took a few minutes to check that oars, rudder, and the small mast and sail were all safely stowed. The incoming tide was lapping about a third of the way up the skiff now, and he knew that it was high as it was going to come. In a few minutes it would start to go out, and he and Evanlyn would go with it. Vaguely, he knew that the coast of Tootland was somewhere to the south of them, or perhaps they might sight a ship now that the summer gales seemed to be moderating. He didn't dwell too much on that. He simply knew that he could not remain a prisoner. If it came to it, he would rather die trying to be free. "Can't sit here all night," he said. "Take the other side and let's get this boat in the water. Lift first, then push." Taking hold of the gunwales on either side, they heaved and strained together. At first it struck fast in the shingle, but once they lifted and broke the hold, it began to slide more easily. Then it was afloat, and the two of them clambered aboard. Will gave one last shove with his foot, and the skiff drifted out from the beach. Will felt a moment of triumph. Then he realized he didn't have time to congratulate himself. Evanlyn, white-faced and tense, was clinging to the gunwales on either side of her as the boat rocked in the small waves. "So far, so good," she said, but her voice betrayed the nervousness she was feeling. Clumsily, he settled the oars in the oarlocks. He'd watched Svengel do it dozens of times, but now he found that watching and doing were two different matters, and for the first time he had a twinge of doubt. Maybe he'd taken on more than he could handle. He tried a clumsy stroke with the oars, stabbing at the water and heaving. He missed on the left-hand side, crabbing the boat around and nearly falling into the floorboards. "Slowly," Evanlyn advised him, and he tried again with greater care. This time he felt a welcome surge of movement through the boat. He recalled that he'd seen Svengel twisting the oars at the end of each stroke to prevent the blades grabbing in the water. When he did the same, the action was easier. With more confidence, he took a few more strokes, and the boat moved more smoothly. The tide was taking effect now, and when Evanlyn looked back at the beach, she felt a lurch of fear to see how far they had come. Will noticed her reaction. "It'll move faster as we get out into the middle," he told her between strokes. "We're just on the edge of the tide run." "Will," she cried out in an alarmed voice, "there's water in the boat." The wrappings around her feet had prevented her from feeling the water so far, but now it had soaked through, and when she looked down she could see water surging back and forth over the floorboards. "It's just spray," he said carelessly. "We'll bail her out once we're clear of the harbor." "It's not spray," she replied, her voice cracking. "The boat is leaking. Look!" He looked down, and his heart leaped into his mouth. She was right. There were several centimeters of water above the floorboards of the skiff, and the level seemed to be rising. "Oh, my goodness," he said. "Start bailing quickly." There was a small bucket in the stern, and she seized it and began frantically scooping water over the side. But the level was slowly gaining on her, and Will could feel the boat responding more sluggishly as more water rushed in. Go back! Go back! Evanlin yelled at him. All thought of secrecy was abandoned now. Will nodded, too busy to talk, and heaved desperately on one oar, swinging the boat around to head for the beach. Now he had to fight against the tide run, and panic made him clumsy. He missed a stroke and overbalanced again, nearly losing an oar over the side. His mouth was dry with fear as he grabbed at the oar, catching it at the last minute. Evanlin, scooping frantically at the water in the boat, realized that she was spilling as much water back in as she was throwing overboard. She fought down the sick feeling of panic and forced herself to bail more calmly. That was better, she thought, but the water was still gaining on her. Luckily, Will had the good sense to move the boat sideways, back to the edge of the tide run, where the outflow was not as fierce. Free of the grip of the main current, the boat began to make better headway. But it was still settling deeper into the water, and the deeper it settled, the faster the inflow of water became, and the more difficult the boat became to row. "Keep rowing!" Evanlin encouraged him. He grunted, heaving desperately on the oars, dragging the sluggish boat slowly back to shore. They nearly made it. They were 3 meters from the beach when the little boat finally went under. The sea poured over the gunwales, and it sank beneath them. As they floundered in the waist-deep water, staggering with exhaustion, Will realized that, free of their weight, the skiff was floating again, just below the surface. He took hold and guided it back to the shallows, Evanlin following him. "Trying to kill yourselves," said a grim voice. They looked up to see Eric standing by the water's edge. Several of his crew stood behind him, broad grins on their faces. "Jarl Eric," Will began, then stopped. There was nothing to say. Eric was turning a small object over in his hands. He tossed it to Will. "Maybe you forgot this," he said, his voice ominous. Will studied the object. It was a small cylinder of wood, perhaps 6 centimeters long and 2 across. He stared at it, uncomprehending. "That's what we simple sailors call a bung," Eric explained sarcastically. "It stops water from coming into the boat. Usually it's a good idea to make sure it's in place." Will's shoulders slumped. He was soaked, exhausted, and shaking from the gut-gripping fear of the past 10 minutes. Most of all, he felt a massive sense of despondency at their failure. A cork. Their plan was in ruins because of a blasted cork. Then a massive hand grabbed the front of his shirt, and he was hauled off his feet, his face centimeters from Eric's angry features. "Don't ever take me for a fool, boy," the Scandian snarled at him. "You try anything like this again, and I'll flog the skin off you." He turned to include Evanlin in the threat. "Both of you." He waited until he was sure his warning had hit home, then hurled Will away from him. The apprentice ranger sprawled on the hard stones of the beach, utterly defeated. "Now get back to the hut," Eric told them.